In the last section, we figured out how to handle users typing into an input tag. We did this by first defining the input handler, which is a function, and then we passed it to the property onChange inside of the JSX tag. We passed it specifically to the onChange event because any function passed to it will automatically be called when the input's normal change event is triggered. In this section, we're going to start by talking about one of the most confusing topics in React, state. I figured it was probably better to bring this up sooner rather than later. State is almost definitely one of the hardest to understand topics in React, and you'll find that it comes into the front and center when we start concentrating on Redux as well. So in this section, we're going to focus on making sure that you have a solid grasp on exactly what state is. So let me start by defining it. State is a plain JavaScript object that is used to record and react to user events. Each class-based component that we define has its own state object. Whenever a component's state is changed, the component immediately re-renders and also forces all of its children to re-render as well. So if search bar had some state and it changed, the render function would be re-ran, and if we had other components inside of here as well, those would be re-rendered as well. Before we ever use state inside of a component, we need to initialize the state object. To initialize state, we set the property state to a plain JavaScript object inside of the class's constructor method. And okay, yeah, that's super confusing. I know, crazy confusing. Let's start throwing some code down and discuss what's happening. So inside of search bar, I'm going to add a new method at the very top. And we're going to call it constructor. I'm going to put some code down here, and then we'll talk exactly what's going on. I'm going to add an argument called props. And then we're going to call super props. And then we'll say this.state equals an object where term is an empty string, like so. Okay, so this bit of code right here is going to start to get really familiar really quickly. This is how we define state, or we initialize state, in a class-based component. Remember, functional components do not have state. Only class-based components do. So here's the summary. All JavaScript classes have a special function called constructor. The constructor function is the first and only function called automatically whenever a new instance of the class is created. So you can imagine that, in reality, this function gets called all the time because it's called whenever we create a new instance of search bar, like right here inside of index.js. The constructor function is reserved for doing some setup inside of our class, like initializing variables and initializing state and stuff like that. So one weird thing that's going on in here is this super right here. Remember how our component search bar extends component? Well, component itself has its own constructor function. When we define a method that is already defined on the parent class, which is component, we can call that parent method on the parent class by calling super. I know that's confusing. Please just bear with me for a bit and we'll focus on state for now, and we'll talk more about super later on. If you have an object-oriented programming background or you've ever taken like CS classes, all we're doing here is we're calling the parent method here with super. If you're not familiar with any of that, really don't sweat it. You can kind of view this as a little bit of black magic for right now. If you don't call super here, you'll end up with an error, so don't sweat it. It'll always catch it for you. The second expression here is the one that we really care about. It's much more interesting. It has to do with state. So whenever we use state, we initialize it by creating a new object and assigning it to this.state. The object we pass will also contain properties that we want to record on the state. In this case right here, we want to record the term, or really property term on state. Term being short for like search term, basically. So whenever the user updates the search input, this is the property right here. This term is the property they want to update that or record that change on. So over time, you could kind of imagine, as we're going to do in the next section here very shortly, as the user starts typing inside the input, we want to update this.state.term to not be empty string, but to be the value of the input. Okay, so let's continue talking about state in the next section.